I never expected that a burst pipe in my neighbor's apartment would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when my quiet, predictable world was flooded with the possibility of something new. Before that Monday, my life was a collection of carefully curated routines. My name is Miles, and at 26, I worked as a city archivist. My days were spent in the hushed, climate-controlled silence of the municipal archives, surrounded by the faint, dry scent of aging paper and leather-bound ledgers. My evenings were just as quiet, spent in my small one-bedroom apartment, a sanctuary of order and solitude that I had meticulously arranged to be a buffer against the noisy, unpredictable world outside. My apartment building was an old one, a brick monolith from a bygone era with charming quirks and frustrating inefficiencies in equal measure. The walls were thin, not so thin that you could hear conversations, but thin enough to be aware of the life humming just on the other side. I was acutely aware of the life in apartment 4B, the one right next to mine. That was Julian's apartment. I didn't know him, not really. We'd only ever exchanged the briefest of nods in the hallway, the kind of non-committal gesture you give a stranger you see every day. From what I could gather through the wall and our brief encounters, Julian was my opposite. I'd hear his heavy work boots on the floorboards early in the morning, the sound of a loud, boisterous playlist starting up, and then the solid, definitive click of his door shutting as he left for the day. He often came home late, sometimes smelling faintly of sawdust and fresh paint, other times of the crisp evening air. He looked like his job, whatever it was, I guess some kind of construction or carpentry. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked capable and calloused. His face was all strong lines, softened by a pair of surprisingly gentle hazel eyes and a smile that seemed to come easily to him. On weekends, the muffled sound of laughter and music would bleed through the wall from his place. He had friends, lots of them it seemed. I'd see them sometimes, a rotating cast of men and women, all of them loud and confident and easy with one another. They looked like they belonged to a world I only observed from a distance. In my mind, Julian was firmly categorized. He was handsome, confident, popular, and, I assumed with a quiet certainty, completely and utterly straight. He was a fixed point in the background of my life, a pleasant but unattainable feature of my daily scenery, like a handsome statue in a park you admire but never think of touching. My own life moved at a much gentler pace. My evenings consisted of reading, listening to soft instrumental music, and perhaps a documentary about ancient history. It wasn't a bad life. It was safe. It was controlled. But there was a persistent, low-grade loneliness that hummed just beneath the surface of my contentment. I had convinced myself that this quiet solitude was a choice, a preference for peace over chaos. But sometimes, late at night, when I'd hear the echo of Julian's laughter through the wall, I'd feel a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It was a longing for a connection I didn't know how to seek, for a world that felt impossibly far from my own. That's how things were, in their neat, separate boxes. Me in 4A, him in 4B. Two different orbits, spinning in close proximity but never destined to intersect. Then came the flood. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting at my small dining table, meticulously cataloging some personal photographs for a scrapbook. The air was still and quiet, filled only with the soft rustle of paper and the low hum of my refrigerator. Then I heard it, a faint dripping sound. At first, I dismissed it as the building's old plumbing, a common and usually benign noise. But the dripping grew steadier, more insistent. It was soon joined by a dark, creeping stain spreading from beneath the shared wall with Julian's apartment. A sense of dread pooled in my stomach. I rushed to the hallway and saw it, a steady trickle of water seeping from under my front door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew Julian wasn't home. I'd heard him leave early that morning, and I seemed to recall him mentioning to another neighbor that he was on a 2-day job out of town. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Henderson, our elderly and perpetually flustered landlord. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice a gravelly wheeze. I explained the situation, my words tumbling over one another in my anxiety. An hour later, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Mr. Henderson had arrived with an emergency plumber, a burly man who had to force the lock on Julian's door. The moment it swung open, a small wave of cold water washed over the hallway floor. The sight inside was devastating. A pipe under his kitchen sink had burst, and the entire apartment was under at least an inch of water. His rug was soaked, the legs of his wooden furniture were dark with moisture, and the air was thick with the smell of damp drywall. They shut off the water main, and the plumber got to work, but the damage was already done. Mr. Henderson wrung his hands, his face a mask of distress. "It's going to take days to fix this," he lamented, shaking his head. "We'll have to tear out the flooring, dry the subfloor. He can't stay here. It's not safe." He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. I knew what was coming before he even said it. "Miles, son, I know this is a huge imposition, but he'll be back tonight. All the hotels are booked because of that big convention downtown. Would it be at all possible for him to stay with you? Just for a night or two, until we can figure something else out?" My mind screamed no. My apartment was my space, my refuge. The idea of sharing it, of having my routine so thoroughly disrupted, was terrifying, especially with him, with Julian, the man from the other side of the wall, the man who represented everything I was not. But looking at Mr. Henderson's panicked face and thinking of Julian returning from a long trip to find his home destroyed, I heard a different word come out of my mouth. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Of course. He can stay with me." Julian arrived just after 10 that night. I heard his keys jangling in the hall, followed by a confused silence, and then Mr. Henderson's low, apologetic voice. I opened my door a crack and peeked out. Julian stood there, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his face etched with exhaustion and disbelief as he stared into his ruined apartment. He ran a hand through his already messy brown hair, and for the first time, he didn't look like the confident, carefree guy from my imagination. He just looked tired. Mr. Henderson gestured toward me. "Miles here has generously offered to let you stay with him for a couple of nights." Julian's gaze shifted to me, and his hazel eyes were filled with a dazed sort of gratitude. "Really?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. "Man, you don't have to do that." "It's no problem," I said, opening my door wider. The words felt foreign and too loud in the quiet hallway. "Seriously, come on in." He hesitated for a moment, then gave a small, weary nod. "Thank you," he said, stepping across my threshold. Seriously, thank you." And just like that, the barrier between our two worlds dissolved, washed away by a torrent of water and a reluctant act of kindness. My quiet, orderly life was over. The first 24 hours were an exercise in excruciating awkwardness. My apartment, which had always felt like the perfect size for one, suddenly seemed claustrophobically small with the addition of another person, especially a person as physically present as Julian. He seemed to take up more space, breathe more air. His duffel bag sat by the door like a foreign object, and his work boots, placed neatly on the mat, looked enormous and out of place next to my simple loafers. I gave him the tour, which took all of 30 seconds. "This is the living room, which is also the dining room. That's the one bathroom. And this is my bedroom." I insisted he take my bed, but he flatly refused, his cheeks flushing slightly. "No way, man. I'm the one imposing. The couch is more than fine," he said with a finality that brooked no argument. So I set him up with my best pillows and a clean set of sheets, feeling his eyes on me as I tried to make the lumpy sofa look remotely comfortable. The silence between us was heavy, punctuated only by the mundane sounds of domesticity, the running of a faucet, the click of a light switch, that now felt charged with significance. The next morning, I woke up early, my body still humming with a nervous energy that had robbed me of a good night's sleep. I tiptoed into the living room and found Julian already awake, sitting on the edge of the couch and staring at the floor. He looked even more tired than the night before. I quietly made coffee, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the strangeness of the situation. I poured 2 mugs and handed one to him. "Thanks," he mumbled, his fingers brushing against mine as he took it. A tiny, insignificant spark shot up my arm, and I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. He didn't seem to notice. We spent the day in our own separate corners. I retreated to my desk, pretending to work, while he spent hours on the phone with his insurance company and a very apologetic Mr. Henderson, his voice a low, frustrated rumble. But as the day wore on, something began to shift. The suffocating awkwardness started to give way to a tentative comfort. He started asking me questions about my job, his brow furrowed in genuine interest as I tried to explain the painstaking process of preserving centuries-old documents. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen. That evening, he insisted on ordering takeout to thank me. We sat on my small couch, balancing containers of Thai food on our laps. And he started to talk. He told me about his father, who had started the contracting business and passed away a few years ago. I feel like I'm always trying to fill his shoes, he said, staring down at his noodles. He was so good with people, a natural. I feel like I'm faking it half the time. It was a startling confession. This man, who I had perceived as the pinnacle of self-assurance, was admitting to a deep-seated insecurity, a vulnerability that mirrored my own in a strange way. The image I had built of him began to crumble, replaced by something far more complex and real. He seemed less like a handsome statue and more like a person. Later that night, he was sketching in a small, worn notebook he'd salvaged from his apartment. I caught a glimpse of the pages over his shoulder. They weren't rough construction plans. They were beautiful, intricate drawings of furniture, of architectural details, of ornate building facades. The lines were delicate and precise, revealing a sensitivity and an artistic talent I never would have guessed at. Wow, I breathed out, unable to help myself. Those are incredible, Julian. He looked up, a deer-in-the-headlights expression on his face, and quickly shut the book. A dark blush crept up his neck. It's just a hobby. Nothing, really, but his reaction told me it was more than nothing. It was a private part of himself, a hidden world of creativity that stood in stark contrast to the rugged, practical exterior he presented. He was revealing layers I never knew existed, and with each one, the distance between us seemed to shrink. The most significant moment, though, was a small one. It happened on the third night. I was at my desk, squinting at a faded 19th century map, when he quietly approached from behind. "You've been at that for hours," he said softly. I turned to find him holding a steaming mug. "I made some tea. Thought you might need it." I reached for the mug, my mind still half on the map. As I took it from him, my fingers clumsy with fatigue, they brushed against his for a second longer than necessary. This time, the contact was unmistakable. It wasn't an accident. It was a soft, warm pressure that lingered. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. He was looking right at me, a small, unreadable smile playing on his lips. His hazel eyes were dark in the dim light of my desk lamp, and for a heart-stopping moment, I felt like he could see right through me. He didn't say anything else. He just gave a slight nod and walked back to the couch, leaving me with a racing heart and a mug of chamomile tea that I was suddenly too flustered to drink. It was just a touch, just a glance, but it felt like a question being asked, one I had no idea how to answer. By the fourth day, a new, fragile routine had settled over us. The initial awkwardness had mostly faded, replaced by a comfortable, almost domestic rhythm. We moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken understanding, a quiet choreography of shared living. I learned that he liked his coffee black, that he hummed off-key when he was focused on something, and that he had a surprisingly gentle way of folding the blankets on the couch each morning, leaving them in a neat pile. He learned that I couldn't function without my morning tea, that I organized my books by color, and that I had a nervous habit of tapping my fingers when I was thinking. We were learning the small, intimate details of each other's lives, details that felt far more significant than the polite greetings we used to exchange in the hallway. The tension from that moment with the teacup still lingered in the air, though. It was a low hum beneath our easy conversations, a new awareness that charged the small space between us. I found myself watching him more, noticing the way his t-shirt stretched across his shoulders when he reached for something on a high shelf, or the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he genuinely smiled. I was falling, and the feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to be careful, that I was misreading everything, that I was projecting my own lonely hopes onto his simple kindness. But my heart, that foolish, traitorous organ, didn't want to listen. On Friday night, his apartment was still a disaster zone of industrial fans and dehumidifiers. He announced he was taking me out for a proper dinner, not just takeout on the couch, as a thank you for putting up with him all week. "Put on something nice," he said with a grin. My treat, the word date, hung unspoken in the air between us. A possibility so bright it was almost blinding. I spent far too long getting ready, changing my shirt 3 times before settling on a simple, dark blue button-down. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, my stomach a flutter of nerves and anticipation. I ran a comb through my hair for the 10th time, and then reached for the one small luxury I allowed myself: a bottle of cologne. It was a scent I'd worn for years, a subtle blend of sandalwood and cedarwood that was warm and earthy. It was my scent, a quiet statement in a life of quietness. I sprayed a light mist on my neck and wrists, the familiar fragrance a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. When I stepped out of the bathroom, Julian was waiting in my bedroom doorway, leaning against the frame. He had already changed into a dark gray Henley that fit him perfectly, and his hair was still slightly damp from the shower. He was watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. His eyes dropped from my face, down my neck, and then back up again. "That smells good," he said, his voice a little lower than usual. "What is it?" I held up the bottle, my hand trembling slightly. "It's just sandalwood," I managed to say, my throat suddenly dry. He pushed off from the doorframe and took a step towards me. Then another. He closed the distance between us until he was standing so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The air grew thick, heavy. "Can I try it?" he asked, his gaze locked on mine. It was such a strange, intimate request. My mind went blank. All I could do was nod, a jerky, puppet-like motion. I expected him to take the bottle from my hand. He didn't. Instead, he gently took the cologne, his fingers brushing mine in a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver down my spine. But he didn't spray it on his own wrist. He lifted the bottle and aimed it at the side of his neck, his eyes never leaving my face as he pressed down once. The fine mist settled on his skin, and then he did something that shattered my entire world. He leaned in, closing the last few inches between us. He turned his head slightly and pressed his face into the curve of my neck, right where I had sprayed the cologne moments before. He breathed in, a long, slow, deliberate inhale. Time seemed to stop. I could feel his warm breath on my skin, the slight scratch of his evening stubble, the overwhelming presence of him so close he was almost a part of me. My own breathing hitched, my entire body frozen in a state of shock and dizzying anticipation. He stayed there for a long moment, his eyes closed, just breathing me in. Then he pulled back, just enough so I could see his face. His expression was serious, his pupils dilated. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice a low, husky rumble that vibrated through my chest. "Smells better on you." He straightened up, but the space he left behind tingled, alive with the ghost of his touch. He handed the bottle back to me, his fingers wrapping around mine for a fraction of a second too long. The world tilted on its axis. This was no longer about kindness or gratitude. This was something else entirely. It was a line being crossed, a message being sent without a single word. And I had no idea what to do next. The air, once filled with a comfortable, burgeoning friendship, was now thick with a new and terrifying tension. The short walk to the restaurant was silent. The easy chatter we had developed over the past few days had evaporated, leaving a vacuum of unspoken thoughts. I was intensely aware of the space between us on the sidewalk, a gulf that felt both a mile wide and magnetically charged. I kept replaying the moment in my bedroom over and over in my head. His closeness, the warmth of his breath, the low timbre of his voice. It couldn't have been nothing. Right. Dinner was an excruciating affair. We sat in a small, dimly lit Italian restaurant, the scent of garlic and wine heavy in the air. We both ordered, we both ate, but the conversation was stilted and unnatural. We talked about the weather. We talked about the traffic. We talked about anything and everything except the one thing that was screaming in the silence between us. Julian kept looking at me, his gaze intense and searching, but whenever I met his eyes, he'd quickly look away, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He seemed just as lost as I was. The walk home was even quieter. When we got back to my apartment, the familiar space felt alien and hostile. The air was charged, humming with an energy that was almost painful. "Well," Julian said, clearing his throat and gesturing vaguely towards the couch. "Thanks for dinner. You paid," I pointed out, my voice sounding small and weak. "Right. Well, thanks for coming with me," he corrected, not quite looking at me. He immediately went to the couch, and I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door behind me, an act that felt like raising a fortress wall. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind. What did it mean? Was I completely delusional? Was this just how straight guys behaved? Maybe it was some kind of strange, tactile form of male bonding I was utterly unfamiliar with. The thought was almost laughable. No, the way he looked at me, the way he breathed me in. It was deliberate. It was intimate. A dangerous, fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in my chest. It was a feeling so potent it made me feel sick with fear. Because if I was right, if that moment meant what I thought it meant, then everything was about to change. But if I was wrong, the humiliation would be crushing. The risk of misunderstanding felt monumental. It was safer to believe I was imagining it all, to retreat back into the safety of my shell and pretend nothing had happened. But I couldn't. The memory of his closeness was seared into my skin. The next day, Saturday, was worse. The tension was a palpable thing in the apartment, a third resident that took up all the oxygen. We moved around each other like ghosts, our movements careful and planned to avoid any accidental contact. We spoke only when necessary, in clipped, polite sentences. Is the bathroom free? Do you want some coffee? It was a miserable regression to being strangers, but worse, because now we were strangers who had shared something profound and were pretending we hadn't. I spent the day trying to lose myself in a book, but the words just swam before my eyes. My focus was entirely consumed by him. I was aware of his every movement, every sigh, every shift and weight on the couch. My internal monologue was a relentless cycle of analysis and second-guessing. I dissected every word, every gesture from the past week, searching for clues, for confirmation. The memory of his face in my neck was a constant, looping image in my mind's eye. It was hope and fear, locked in a brutal battle for control of my heart, and the uncertainty was tearing me apart. I wanted to scream, to ask him what was happening, but the words were lodged in my throat, paralyzed by the terror of being wrong. The agonizing silence stretched into the evening. I was sitting on my armchair, the unread book lying open in my lap, when Julian finally broke it. He had been staring at the opposite wall for what felt like an hour, his hands clasped between his knees. He took a deep breath, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room, and turned to face me. His expression was strained, his eyes shadowed with a turmoil that mirrored my own. "Miles," he started, his voice a little hoarse. He cleared his throat. "Can we talk? I feel like I made things weird last night, and I'm sorry." My heart began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. Was he going to laugh it off, apologize for being strange, and shatter the fragile hope I'd been clinging to? "It's okay," I said, the lie feeling like ash in my mouth. "No, it's not," he insisted, shaking his head. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and looking at the floor between his feet. "The thing with the cologne, that wasn't just random. I wasn't just being weird." He looked up then, and his eyes, full of a terrifying vulnerability, met mine. "I've been an idiot, Miles, and I haven't been totally honest with you." I held my breath, my entire being focused on him, on his next words. "The landlord called me on Tuesday, when the pipe first burst," he continued, his words coming out in a rush. "He told me my place was flooded. And my first thought wasn't about the damage. It was about you." My breath hitched. "I knew you were right next door. And I've been noticing you for a while. In the hall, coming and going. I never had the courage to say anything more than hey." He let out a shaky laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. "So when Mr. Henderson suggested I ask you about staying here, I jumped at it. It was the perfect excuse. I thought if I could just spend some time with you, I could figure out if there was something there. If you were." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely with one hand. He took another shaky breath. "But I've been so scared of misreading it. And I've never felt this way about a guy before. It's new for me. And it's you. And it's confusing and terrifying. And last night, I acted on impulse. It was stupid. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." A tidal wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, crashed over me. He wasn't laughing it off. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared and confused as I was. His honesty was a gift, a key that unlocked the words trapped inside my own throat. "You didn't make me uncomfortable," I said, my voice trembling but clear. I've noticed you too, Julian. For a long time, a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, a sunrise after a long, dark night. But I assumed you were straight. I thought I was too, he admitted with a shrug. But then I kept finding myself manufacturing reasons to be in the hallway at the same time as you. Turns out, I'm not very subtle. We both laughed then, a real laugh, and the unbearable tension that had filled the room for the last day finally, blessedly, broke. He stood up from the armchair and crossed the small space between us, sitting down on the edge of the couch, close to my chair. The energy between us was different now. The anxiety was gone, replaced by a fizzing, hopeful excitement. So, he said softly, his knee almost touching mine. I guess I wasn't imagining it. No, I whispered. You weren't. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently took my hand. His calloused palm was warm and solid around mine. He looked from our joined hands to my eyes. Can I try something else? He asked, his voice low and full of a question that had nothing to do with cologne. I didn't need words. I just nodded. He leaned in, and this time, there was no hesitation. He pressed his lips to mine. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, but as I responded, leaning into him, it deepened. It was a kiss full of all the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the hope and fear of the past week. It was confident and sure, a mutual and profound confirmation. It was the beginning of everything. In the weeks that followed, my world bloomed into color. Julian's apartment was eventually repaired, the floors replaced, the walls repainted, but he rarely slept there. My small apartment, once a fortress of solitude, became our shared space. He'd leave his work boots by the door, and the sight of them no longer felt intrusive. It felt like home. The faint scent of sawdust now mingled with the old paper smell of my books, creating a fragrance that was uniquely ours. We went on our first real date to that same Italian restaurant, and this time, there was no awkward silence. We talked for hours, our hands intertwined on the checkered tablecloth. Laughter came easily, and the charged glances from across the table were no longer filled with anxiety, but with affection and a quiet, joyful certainty. He took me to his workshop, a large, dusty space that smelled wonderfully of cedar and varnish. He showed me his designs, his face lit up with a passion I'd never seen before as he traced the lines of a future chair or table with his fingertips. His world, which had once seemed so separate from mine, was opening up to me, and I was stepping into it with a sense of wonder. I, in turn, showed him my world. He came to the archives one afternoon, his large frame looking comically out of place among the fragile, ancient documents. But he was fascinated, asking thoughtful questions as I showed him centuries-old maps and letters written in elegant, looping script. He met my two quiet friends, and to my surprise, he charmed them effortlessly. I met his loud, boisterous group of friends, and to my even greater surprise, they welcomed me with open arms, slinging an arm around my shoulder and handing me a beer as if I'd always been a part of their circle. We were weaving our lives together, thread by careful thread, creating a new pattern that was stronger and more beautiful than anything I could have managed on my own. About 2 months after that first, life-altering kiss, we were getting ready to go out one evening. It had become our new routine, a comfortable dance of sharing the small bathroom and navigating around each other in the bedroom. I was tying my shoes when I looked up and saw Julian standing in front of my dresser. He picked up the familiar glass bottle of my cologne. He didn't look at me. He just sprayed a single mist onto the side of his neck, the way he had that first night. Then he turned, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. He walked over to me and pulled me up from the bed, wrapping his arms around my waist. He drew me close, burying his face in the curve of my neck, right where my own pulse was beating a steady, happy rhythm. He breathed in deeply, a long, contented sigh. The gesture, once so fraught with tension and uncertainty, was now an act of pure, comfortable intimacy. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, his own sparkling with warmth. "Still smells better on you," he murmured, his voice a low, happy rumble. And then he kissed me, a slow, loving kiss that tasted of certainty and home. I used to believe that my life was best when it was ordered, predictable, and safe within the walls I had so carefully constructed. I thought any disruption would be a catastrophe. But Julian's arrival, born from the chaos of a burst pipe and a flooded floor, wasn't a catastrophe. It was a revelation. He didn't just disrupt my routine. He dismantled it and helped me build something far better in its place. Sometimes the foundations of your life have to get washed out from under you, just so you have the chance to build something new, something stronger, with someone else. I never expected a simple plumbing disaster to lead me to love, but I'm learning that the very best things in life are almost always the ones you never, ever expect.